about cutting the mayor's salary, i.e. yours, by 6% in the citizen committee report? And number two, what do you think of having to vote every year, council having to vote every year for increases or decreases in our wages?
Tell you what, I'll give you a bonus answer. I'll answer number three as well on that topic. Number one, I'm totally fine with it. In fact, I've been saying for some years that the previous citizen committee, I thought, had pegged the mayor's salary a bit too high, but I also wanted to respect that it's a volunteer committee and councillors shouldn't set their own salaries up or down, which is why every year I've donated a big percentage of my salary to charity, because I did think it was too high. I just shouldn't mess with the citizen committee. So I'm totally fine with it. The citizen committee has a very good rationale for why they're recommending it, so all good. Number two, I do think, however, that the process that we have with the citizen committee is the right process. Council can always refuse or amend it if they want to, but it's sort of like the old days of negative option billing. And I think that's the right way to go. I don't think council should vote on it every year, because it ends up then being political, and it undermines the work of the Citizen Volunteer Committee, in my opinion. So I suggest that that is actually not a good recommendation, that one from the committee. I think if the committee is confident in their recommendations, and they are, that they shouldn't need that extra political check from council. I don't think politicians should be setting their own salaries except in extraordinary circumstances, and it makes more sense to just abide by the committee's recommendations, I think. And the third question that you didn't ask me, but I'm going to give you a bonus, is I actually didn't know the extent of this transition allowance until very recently. I didn't even know that existed. So I am not at all upset about getting rid of it. I am, however, going to suggest to my colleagues on council that this is something that's been bugging me for a while, is that we are not very humane with people who are leaving office at the last minute in terms of helping them work out their benefits, helping them figure out outplacement work, even giving them assistance in cleaning up and moving out their offices. So that just pegged in my mind that there is probably a need before this election to clean up our policies around what transition looks like for people who are leaving or who lose an election. But I'm not particularly opposed to ending that allowance that I never even knew existed.
So Mayor, if I understand correctly, are you saying that you're okay with councillors voting on it, but not every year, maybe once per term?
Yeah, I think what we should do is, the system, the way it works now, is we set up this committee once per term to make recommendations for the next council. So you're actually voting not for yourself, but for the next council. I think that makes sense. I think that we should do that once per term. Council always retains the right to change it if they have a necessary reason. There's a couple of times because of economic downturns, or because we felt that we wanted to set an example, a budgetary example in the city's budget, that we have chosen to take a lesser or a zero increase. Council can retain that right. I just don't think it should be an annual thing. I think the process we have of the one council making the decision for the next council is one that makes sense.
But you were talking.
I'm going to put that for the optics of it though too. Is it in defense of even the councils? So it's fair to sort of put that back on councils. The ones I spoke to today said they'd rather.
No, that's right, because it goes both ways. A lot of members of the public will say, well, if politicians are voting on their own salaries, they're just going to ratchet up their salaries. What is much more likely is the opposite, is that councillors will actually say, you know what, I'm going to forego any increases, and they'll just forego them and forego them and forego them. And then you come to a point where you're way out of market, people don't want to run for office anymore, and then you have to do a giant increase. And that's not right either. So if we trust a volunteer group to come up with the recommendations. This is a great group. It includes just regular everyday citizens and human resources professionals who came together as volunteers to do this. And if this is their recommendation, let's actually abide by the recommendation.
But did this citizen group advocate?
Yeah, I know, it's a bit weird.
So you were saying in previous decisions you respected what the citizen group said, and this is one where you're not following with the
I didn't quite get the rationale for that particular recommendation, to be honest.
So in terms of you've been getting a portion of charity that you thought was too high. So now with the cut that they're telling you to take, does that stop the charity?
It's actually funny you would ask that question, because this morning my very first meeting was I chair something called the Board of Nominators for the Calgary Foundation, and the Calgary Foundation has been the recipient of much of my charitable giving, and so that was actually their first question. So no, if you take the pay cut, can we expect less? I will hope to continue that level of charitable giving as long as I can.
Did you actually give the pay hike, or what was the...
No, what I do is a flat 10% of my salary. And as the salary goes up, that goes up. In fact, it's a funny story that many of you have heard, which is I always forget to make the donation, and every year the same thing happens. Between Christmas and New Year's, I go, oh, I have to make that donation. And then I go, what's my salary? And I Google, and I look for the news story from the previous January that tells me what my salary is, and I take 10% of that number.
Again, the touchy thing, you also get the charitable taxes.
But of course, I pay tax on that money too, so it's just a matter of pushing that through
It's
that.
Calgary the way to go because provincial and federal, they get a third of it tax-free and you guys don't.
Now that's an interesting punditry question. That change to remove the 1/3 tax-free portion was made sometime before I was the mayor. I actually thought that that was not a great change to make because although it's more transparent, it actually removes one of the few sources of federal and provincial funding that the city of Calgary gets in its operating grant. I'm really 6 of one, half dozen of the other on it. I think if we were to take the tax-free allowance, then you would have to report the salary as though you didn't take the tax-free allowance, so people really knew what it was. For me, it's a more technical thing than anything else.
What do you think of the councillor pay recommendation? Councillor pay relative to other cities is fairly high, but the committee recommended not to change it.
Well, for a minute, I will admit to saying for a minute, hey, they benchmarked my salary, the councillor's salary was benchmarked at the exact same level, but they're keeping theirs and I'm taking a cut. It's fine. That is really a question for the councillors to decide. I will tell you that as a citizen, long before I had any dreams of entering politics, back in 2000, 2001, I really supported an increase to the pay of councillors because they were paid as though it was a part-time job, and it's not a part-time job anymore. And when you look at somebody like Sue Higgins, who spent her entire career as a single mom doing that job and getting paid, frankly, poverty wages, you can't do that. You got to pay people fairly, and you've got to attract people who aren't there for the money, but aren't also taking a huge pay cut to be there as many do. And you also have to make sure that you're paying people fairly enough, because if you don't pay them well and you're surrounded by people who are making investments in millions and millions of dollars, let's just be blunt, the temptation can be too much. So you have to pay people fairly and attract good people. And it seems to me that this committee recommendation suggests that the councillor pay right now does that.
Any thoughts on the Farrell lawsuit?
Oh, so many. So many. Next question. Oh, did you want them?
Yes, I did.
I thought you were just asking if I had any. I will say that, having had personal experience in this, it is incredibly important. Similar to you have to pay people decently if you want to attract people to office, you also got to protect people if you want to attract them to office. And you have to protect politicians against frivolous lawsuits. You have to protect politicians against what are called SLAPs, strategic lawsuits against public participation. Because if wealthy people are allowed to use their money to keep politicians from doing their jobs, or to shut people up if they have opinions that they don't agree with, that's intimidation. I'm not suggesting that's what's happening in this case. It's before the courts. I haven't read the statement of claim. But I will tell you that governments at every level, federal, provincial, and municipal, need to protect public officials as we protect all of our city staff. If Sarah got sued by someone who said, I don't like the way you celebrate Canada Day, we would protect her. And we need to, because she needs to be able to organize Canada Day. And we need to do that for all of our colleagues, including public officials acting in the performance of their duties. I think that's a fundamental tenet of democracy.
What was your reaction though when you heard about the story? Without reading the statement of claim, but even when you read or heard the news story itself that Councillor Farrell was being sued.
Well,
by these.
Well, again, I won't, and I can't speak to the specifics. But I will say that we have a process in place if you feel that there is harassment or abuse of power, and it is the Integrity Commissioner process. It's no cost to the person who's complaining, and it's no cost to the person being complained about, and we have a retired judge whose job it is to mediate these things, and he's very, 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 very smart. If you're not going to avail yourself of that process, and you're going to file a public lawsuit, I would suggest you probably have something else in mind than actual fairness and managing the system well.
What are you saying? You define it as a frivolous lawsuit, or are you just speaking broadly about it?
I'm speaking broadly because I haven't read the statement of claim, but I've had one of those frivolous lawsuits, and indeed, this is stuff you got to be careful about.
All right, folks, I got to wrap this up so we can make our way to the next.
All right, thanks everybody.